Buddhism can be traced to the life of a single individual named Siddhartha Gautama, who lived about 2500 years ago. Raised as a prince, he decided to leave his home at the age of 29 to seek an answer to the problem of human suffering. Through insight and meditation, he gained supreme wisdom, and his teachings form the basis of the many practices we now call Buddhism. Buddhism thrived in India for over 1,000 years, but eventually declined and spread to other parts of Asia and beyond. At the heart of the Buddhist world is the site of Bodh Gaya. Pilgrims visit here from all over the world to pay their homage to the Buddha. This is where the Buddha achieved enlightenment, under the Bodhi tree, so the tree is very significant. The present tree is a descendant of the original. You can see devotees wrap pieces of cloth around it. And right next to the tree is the Mahabodhi temple and many smaller shrines and stupas. Worshippers walk around these sites as an act of devotion. When you see images of the Buddha touching the ground with his right hand, that is usually a reference to his moment of enlightenment, which took place here at Bodh Gaya.
That is a reference to his struggle against Mara, the evil principle, And Mara was tempting Prince Siddhartha before he became the Buddha. And he was putting all kinds of obstacles. And he challenged Prince Siddhartha and said, "Who is your witness that you are qualified to seek the absolute truth?" And instead of saying such and such a guru is my witness or such and such a sacred text is my witness, he touched the earth and said, "The whole earth is my witness, that I have that I have acquired the necessary qualifications for seeking the way out of sorrow." And it is said that the earth shook thrice to confirm his claim.
Another important site associated with the life of the Buddha is Sarnath. Here, the Buddha preached his first sermon near the deer park, and the deer can still be seen roaming around. But the monasteries that were built here lie mostly in ruins. What did the Buddha preach? The nucleus of Buddha's teachings are contained in the Four Noble Truths. These truths are that life is full of suffering, that suffering is caused by desire, that desirelessness is the route to salvation, and that these causes can be eliminated by following the Eightfold Path, also known as the middle path.
The middle path between extreme indulgence and extreme asceticism, because he had joined a company of ascetics, starving and exposing yourself to extremes of cold and heat. And one day he fainted and he said, "This is nonsense. How can I perfect myself like this?"
Followers of the Buddha carried on his teachings by forming monastic communities. And some of these monastic activities took place around stupas and at cave shrines that can still be seen today.
The main focal point in early Buddhism for a monastic complex was the stupa. It's basically a hemispherical mound that represents the burial mound in which relics of the Buddha would have been buried.
So when the Buddha was cremated, there was a dispute about his relics until one of the elders, he calmed them and said, well, our Buddha was a man of peace and we are fighting over his relics. So they distributed the relics, and stupas were erected at 8 places, and the relics were enshrined.
One of the most famous stupas is at Sanchi in central India. This stupa, as you can see, is just a simple, unadorned dome, but the 4 gateways are very elaborately decorated. Worshippers would walk through these gateways and then walk around the stupa in a clockwise direction.
Very early Buddhist art, such as the gateways at Sanchi Stupa, for instance, which were created between 50 BCE and 50 CE, we don't see the Buddha represented.
Stupa became the symbol of the Buddha. So very often in Sanchi you find that elephants from the forest have come and they are paying homage to the stupa. Sometimes you see them paying homage to the tree, the Bodhi tree. Buddha is not shown anywhere in Sanchi.
The gateways here at Sanchi also contain narrative scenes, but the Buddha is never depicted in human form. His presence is indicated in this relief, for instance, by emblems of royalty like the umbrella above the horse, or by his footprints. In scenes of worship, the image of the wheel or of the stupa appear to stand for the Buddha himself. So his presence is indicated by these symbols. We see the fertility goddess, the Yakshi, on one of the railing pillars, and her particular position, and the position of her leg, indicates her kicking the tree into blossoming. Buddhism made use of these types of fertility deities because they had to appeal to popular taste. And so they absorbed many of these local fertility deities into their pantheon. And images such as this were considered highly auspicious, may have served to delineate the transition between sacred and secular space, as well as sanctify the site. A similar image in the Asian Art Museum galleries from a railing pillar probably served in much the same way. The traveler to Western India will most likely encounter a number of Buddhist cave shrines that are located in that region. And this is a practice that developed very early, where monastic groups would create these beautifully decorated caves for the location of their monasteries and their Buddhist shrines. This practice of using caves in this way is probably related to the ancient practice of ascetics in India, who would retreat to mountains and to caves to perform their austerities and their meditations.
Ajanta is in a wonderful setting. These are cliff-like faces that are arranged in a horseshoe shape.
For 3 months in India there is the monsoon. At that time you cannot travel. So they needed, so sometimes monasteries were there, donated by some of the affluent disciples of the Buddha, and for the same purpose to remain during the rainy season in a protected place where their scholarly pursuits may go on. The cave was made through infinite labor. They cut into the mountainside and made a sanctuary. So now I think it is called rock-cut sanctuaries.
They They have congregation halls and they have the individual cells where the monks would have lived. There are also the chaitya halls, which are the halls of worship, and they contain a replica of the stupa and are adorned with capitals along both sides and columns. Ajanta also contains some of the oldest paintings that survive in India. These caves that contain them are very dark, and you can only see these paintings with a flashlight. It's a fascinating place to study early Buddhist art in India.
Very early on in Buddhism, we don't have images of the Buddha that survive. So we don't know if these images once existed or not. But sometime around the 1st century of the Common Era, we start seeing images of the Buddha where previously in stone sculpture, for instance, he had only been depicted by symbols such as the wheel of the law or by his footprint. Part of the reason for the emergence of actual images of the Buddha at such a late date is probably related to the rise of devotionalism. What it represents is this need for worshipers to establish a sort of close relationship with the deity.
As the image of the Buddha evolves, some distinguishing attributes or characteristics emerge.
Well, you see, the Buddha is shown either as seated in a posture of meditation, or he is turning the wheel of dharma. So his 2 fingers are brought together in a gesture of rotating a wheel, because in his first sermon he said, I am now going to set in motion the wheel of dharma.
Images of the Buddha will often display a number of different hand gestures, and probably the most common are the setting into motion of the wheel of the law, the fear not gesture, the gesture of granting a boon, the gesture of meditation, and the gesture of touching the earth, which occurred before his enlightenment.
There are several signs or lakshanas, as they say, and you find that he's invariably depicted with closely curled, snail shell curl hair on his head. He has a little chignon-like thing, which is called the ushnisha. His eyes will be shown almost always downcast, looking down in compassion. His earlobes are often shown distended because Siddhartha Gautama was a prince, and those days the princes used to wear heavy jewelry and their earlobes used to get distended because of the weight of the jewelry.
You have narrative scenes that tell the life story of the Buddha or stories from his previous lives. Some of the most standard scenes from the life of the Buddha that we see depicted are his birth, his enlightenment, miracles that he performed during his lifetime, his death.
And it is said he took him 500 lives to better himself before he could become Buddha. He takes so many different forms, different animal forms, different forms as human beings. Maybe he's a prince, maybe he's a king. Many Buddhas are now developed instead of just one historical Buddha, and one which is a primordial Buddha, and then the Buddhas of the directions. And so now we got the whole multiplicity of Buddha.
You see, the idea is that the Buddha principle is eternal. Wisdom is eternal.
Over the course of time, the stupa was replaced by the Buddha image as the principal object of devotion. One of the most admired representations of the Buddha is this 5th century sandstone sculpture showing the first sermon at Sarnath.
Sometimes people ask me, why are there no great images of Mahatma Gandhi? And I say, 500 years passed before there was a great image of Buddha.
One of the most interesting figures to develop in Buddhist art is the Bodhisattva.
Bodhisattvas have reached the stage when they can achieve enlightenment for themselves. And they have stayed back in the life to help the other sentient beings achieve enlightenment. The most famous, of course, the most popular is a Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. The Sanskrit name itself means the God who looks down in compassion. Avalokita Ishvara. Then there is Bodhisattva Maitreya, and he is the future Buddha to be, the Buddha to come.
The last great flourishing of Buddhist art in India probably occurred between the 8th to 12th centuries under the Pala and Sena dynasties. And these dynasties ruled that area of eastern India, which included many of the sites associated with the Buddha's life, including Bodh Gaya. And what we see in Buddhist sculpture from this period is a greater complexity. Much of the Pala-Sena sculpture produced in eastern India has a very distinctive appearance. It's carved from a very hard, dark-colored stone, and its hardness lends a certain precision to the features of this sculpture. There are several reasons why it may have died out in India, although it survived in certain pockets.
Around the 12th or the 13th centuries, we see the rise of Islam in India, and with the Muslim invasions, we see the destruction of many of the monasteries and the important libraries that constituted the focal point of Buddhist teachings.
As Buddhism and Hinduism evolved together over the centuries, they became much too similar.
So Buddhism has been absorbed into the mainstream of Hinduism and has sustained it from age after age.
Even though Buddhism declined in South Asia, its ideas and practices were carried to nearby regions. Buddhist sculpture and painting came to dominate the religious arts of China, Korea, Japan, and Tibet, for instance. Indian Buddhist art forms, then, are fundamental to the study of Asian art in general.
In India, we encounter the images of the gods and the goddesses in their natural temple settings. When we see them in a museum context, we have the opportunity to view them at a closer distance, appreciating the lines and the rhythm and the artistic quality of the images.
We can look at these works in a museum. You can look at them now as works of art, very lovingly crafted, and still conveying a sense of great beauty and spirituality.
One of the great contributions of Indian art, I believe, is its ability to use human figure to convey the spiritual power and perfection.